After Nicolas Maduro's fall, a new view emerges that casts Vladimir Putin's role in a very different light. Some say Venezuela may show a secret Trump-Putin deal to divide influence, but that's just a hypothesis, not official truth. That's why it needs a cold analysis, not emotions. Why was this hypothesis raised? It didn't arise only after the fall of Maduro. It appeared earlier. The events in Venezuela only dramatically strengthened it. That's an important distinction. Already after a series of contacts between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, phone calls, and the subsequent meeting in Alaska, some analysts began to talk about the possibility that there might not be a classic confrontation between Washington and Moscow, but rather a quiet setting of boundaries. Not a big agreement, not a formal pact, but an unofficial understanding of where each side can act without a direct response from the other. Thank you for your attention. Basic, but practically limited. No escalation, no strong moves, no visible attempt to reverse the situation. Just a required statement on the sovereignty violation. For many, this silence raised questions. Venezuela fits into this scenario too, a country Russia supported politically but never truly controlled, lacking military capabilities, logistics, or any real way to intervene. If there were an informal division of spheres of influence, Latin America would logically be among the areas where Moscow has little leverage and where its resistance remains mostly symbolic. And this is where Alexander Dugin is often mentioned. The Russian ideologue who has long spoken about a world divided into civilizational blocks and spheres of influence. In his concept, South America is repeatedly referred to as the natural sphere of the United States, not as a moral judgment, but as a geopolitical fact. Today, many view these statements as the ideological basis for events in Venezuela. When these factors combine, earlier theories on dividing the world, Trump's close contact with Putin, Dugin's spheres of influence idea, and Maduro's fall without a strong Russian response, a hypothesis begins to make sense to some of the audience. If it were just chaos, the reactions would be different. If it were just improvisation, we would see more resistance. It was precisely this strange combination of tough words and soft actions that opened the door to the theory that Venezuela was not a surprise, but a tolerated move. If it were an agreement, if we were to admit for a moment that the division of spheres of influence between Washington and Moscow really exists, it would not mean a return to the Cold War. It would mean a return to an even older principle, where great powers divide up the space among themselves, where they won't block each other, even if they publicly act as enemies. In this case, Venezuela would set a precedent, not be an exception. A signal that the United States is taking back Latin America as its own sphere of influence without expecting a strong reaction from Moscow. Not because Russia would agree with the American actions, but because it would accept them as the price for having a free hand elsewhere. And this is where we get to Europe. If Venezuela fit into the logic of a quiet division of the world, it would mean that Russia expects compensation in an area it considers existential. Not on the other side of the planet, but in its immediate neighborhood. In Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and the post-Soviet space. In this sense, the fall of Maduro would not be an isolated episode, but part of an informal balance. The United States is consolidating the Western Hemisphere. Russia asserts strong influence east of NATO's borders. No signatures, no treaties, no official acknowledgement, just a quiet understanding of how far each of them can go. Such a world would be less chaotic, but also more dangerous, because it wouldn't be built on rules, but on power and mutual assessment of risk. Smaller states wouldn't be partners in it, but variables. Their security would depend not on international law, but on whether they are in the right sphere. From this perspective, Moscow's lukewarm reaction to events in Venezuela wouldn't be sweet, a sign of weakness or a surprise. It would be the result of calculation. Why escalate a conflict in an area that Russia doesn't have the military capacity to influence anyway, when a much more important game is being played elsewhere? If this logic were true, Venezuela wouldn't concern Latin America, but rather what major powers quietly let slip from their control, in exchange for territory they consider crucial for their own security and power. But it's at this point that this hypothesis starts to collide with reality. Because geopolitics involves more than territory and influence. It's also about money, resources, and long-term costs. And that's exactly where this story starts to break. Where does the hypothesis break? At first glance, the idea of a quiet division of spheres of influence might seem logical, but geopolitics never takes place between just two actors. At this point, there's a player without whom any Washington-Moscow agreements are incomplete: China. If the United States and Russia were really making an informal agreement about spheres of influence, it would also have to fit the reality of China. But Venezuela is exactly the place where Chinese interests directly intersect with American ones. Beijing has long invested there, offering loans, linking oil deliveries to debt payments, and creating an energy backup outside the Middle East. If the United States takes control of the Venezuelan oil sector, it's not just a blow against Maduro. It's also a move in China's energy strategy. Here, the hypothesis's first fundamental problem appears. There is no indication that China would agree to something like that, or that it would be compensated elsewhere. The division of spheres of influence between two powers doesn't make sense in a world where a third power has comparable weight and often a longer strategic horizon. China is not playing a game of short-term political gestures. It is playing a game of supply stability, long-term contracts, and gradual building of influence. And Venezuela fit this model. But even more important is the economic aspect, which concerns Russia. If Venezuela were handed over to the United States in exchange for a free hand elsewhere, Moscow would have to gain something that suits it strategically. However, controlling Venezuelan oil ensures long-term access to its production. Even if it doesn't come into play immediately, it puts pressure on global oil prices. Not a sudden one, but a systematic one. This type of pressure is most dangerous for Russia. The Russian budget is vulnerable to extended periods of low prices. Every dollar down means billions in losses, a weaker currency, and less room to maneuver in both foreign policy and internal stability. In other words, if Russia were to knowingly accept American control over Venezuelan oil, it would also be accepting a future weakening of its own economic position. That's not a favorable trade. That's a strategic loss. Lastly, there's another serious argument. The United States doesn't need to share anything with Moscow to act in Venezuela. Russia doesn't have the military capacity, logistics, or any real possibility to stop American actions in this area. Trump's administration can afford to act unilaterally, not because they have an agreement, but because the other side has no leverage. Combining Chinese interests, oil's effect on Russia, and Latin America's power imbalance, the hypothesis of a silent agreement loses its strong foundation. That doesn't mean contacts between Trump and Putin aren't important. It means that Venezuela probably doesn't reflect them as the result of an agreement, but rather as a consequence of American dominance in a space where they can afford it. And we have analyzed in detail the energy aspect of this operation, oil, prices, and the long-term pressure on Russia, in a separate analysis, because without it, the whole story of Venezuela doesn't make sense. And this is where we come to the conclusion of the whole consideration. Not whether the agreement exists, but why it is even tempting to believe that it does. Why do we keep coming back to these hypotheses? The question isn't only whether Trump and Putin have a silent agreement to divide the world. The real question is why we keep coming back to this idea every time there is a major geopolitical shift. Part of the answer is simple. The world is changing faster than the rules we've used to explain it so far. International law, institutions, and stated values increasingly clash with the realities of power, resources, and unequal advantages. If we don't see clear reactions, we suspect hidden agreements. Without open conflict, we assume a silent compromise. The idea of dividing spheres of influence reflects our own uncertainty more than anything about Trump or Putin, about the feeling that big decisions are made outside the public sphere, without oversight and without rules that smaller states would understand or be able to influence. Venezuela has become a symbol in this story, not because it decides the fate of the world itself, but because it shows how power is shifting today. Less through tanks, more through energy, less through open wars, more through control of flows, prices, and dependencies. What is happening there is not an anomaly. It's a glimpse into the future of conflicts. And that's exactly why it's important to be careful with simple explanations. The world isn't going back to fixed spheres of influence, but it's also not following the ideals we've grown accustomed to. Instead, it moves in a gray zone, where agreements don't have to be signed to work, and where decisions don't have to be announced to have global consequences. Whether the fall of Maduro fits into a grand agreement between the great powers or is simply the result of American dominance in a space where they can afford it, remains an open question. Only one thing is certain. Energy is once again becoming the core of geopolitics, and the states that can control it will gain time, patience, and room to maneuver. And it is in such a world that future conflicts will be decided, not suddenly or loudly, but gradually, in the shadow of markets, prices, and quiet strategic shifts we often notice only when it's too late.
If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for upcoming content. You can also support my work with a donation. And if you want to help the video reach more people, click on share. I appreciate it.